It actually comes from a place of gratitude. I think, given my context, I was born and raised in Nigeria. So I moved there right after high school, and I've always felt this special connection to community because I was raised within a community context, and that's just the way it is in the African context, in the tradition. So I grew up as always being a part of a community in a literal sense.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's again just getting to know people and learning together and just being part of that community. So for me, that brings me joy, both as an individual, certainly as a parent, and it just makes life a little more interesting that way.
We're back out west to visit with another school and educational leader in the Metro Vancouver area. And we once again dive into why that part of the country is as innovative and collaborative as it is. But beyond that, Chris Usih has had the unique experience of serving in very large communities in Toronto, Calgary, and now in that Metro Vancouver area. And we examine what those differences and similarities are between three different provinces and three different very large urban districts. But beyond all of that, I think what appeals to me about my visit with Chris and getting to know him a little bit more is his deep sense of gratitude and joy and focusing on strengths. And those are the things that have always resonated with me. And I just found it fascinating as he's very open about sharing those tenets that he leads by. And it's just been a real pleasure to get to know, and I'll get to continue to know and learn with Chris Usih, superintendent of Richmond School District in British Columbia, Canada. Enjoy. Chris, you and I have a lot to get caught up on. As I've said, and we just talked before, our paths have crossed in different ways, but we've now had a chance to sit down and really talk. And the thing is, Chris, with you, I hear things about you, and they are all very good things. And I will share one thing I heard about you the other day from a colleague of yours and colleague of ours, Chris Kennedy, who said, every time I'm in a room with Chris Usih, I always leave feeling better about myself.
Oh,
How, what, now tell me, like, don't be humble, but tell me why, what it is that you're trying to do that. I don't know if you're trying to do that or just naturally how you are, but you're very, you have a very positive, upbeat spirit about you, and you're really just look towards the good in things. So, where does that come from?
it actually comes from a place of gratitude. I think, given my context, I was born and raised in Nigeria. So I moved there right after high school, and I've always felt this special connection to community because I was raised within a community context, and that's just the way it is in the African context, in the tradition. So I grew up as always being a part of a community in a literal sense.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's again just getting to know people and learning together and just being part of that community. So for me, that brings me joy, both as an individual, certainly as a parent, and it just makes life a little more interesting that way. I don't know. I think that's a simple explanation
Yeah.
for.
No, I think that hits a lot. And I think my experience, and I think probably yours too, is that our immigrant population tends to have that gratitude because they're often coming from places that aren't great and they are just grateful to be here, which is all often a reminder to me, somebody who's been privileged to live my life here, and my grandparents didn't like grow up here, but my parents did. And you forget what a blessed country we live in. And so I think there's lots to be learned from our immigrant population. We're seeing it with a bit fresh eyes, right?
Yes, indeed.
The eyes are a little fresher.
That's right.
And I think about one of the reasons why, Chris, I wanted to have you on the podcast talking about leadership is I'm trying to shine a light on all the great leaders across our country. And we have them. And you in particular have had the unique experience of serving as superintendent and CEO in three different provinces and three of the largest school districts in Canada. So can you just talk a little bit about just, I know
it's hard to think of all the things, but just in general, like how does Toronto and Calgary and now Richmond, British Columbia, what's the same about them, but also what is different and unique about each of those communities?
Well, thank you very much. I would say that, first of all, I spent most of my career in Toronto, and I wasn't the superintendent there, but I was like the deputy in Toronto prior to moving to Calgary, where I was the chief superintendent, and of course now in Richmond. But originally, my first teaching experience, my first 2 years of teaching was in up north in Manitoba, just 2 hours north of Winnipeg, and the First Nations community school, K to 12 school. In terms of your question around the similarities and differences, of course, there are lots we have in common, but there's also the difference in terms of size and scale. Of course, Toronto being the largest school district, then moving to Calgary, where we had 250 schools when I was there, and to a district now just with 48 schools here in Richmond. Obviously, lots in common in terms of the work that we do. We are committed to improving outcomes for young people, obviously, and we are grappling with this challenge of how we make sure that every student experiences success. So uh, that's always area of interest. But I would say that the uh, the difference though would be culture. So what I would say is
Yeah.
that you can import knowledge and experience. You can always bring that with you, knowledge and experience. But one thing you can bring with you is culture. And culture is the work that we do each day that really ultimately leads to trust and to get people excited about the work that we do as a community of learners. So for me, I think culture is certainly that piece. And because the culture is what impacts the work that we do. So I would say I feel very fortunate that in each jurisdiction that I've worked, because regardless of size, obviously those relationships are key to working together. But I think that in my current context here in Richmond, is a smaller district, and because it's a smaller district, you're actually that sense of community is so integral to the work that we do here and those connections. So when I talk about culture, that's why it's so important for to be out there connecting with folks at schools, in workplaces, and so on. Which I do every week because
Mhm.
that's the currency that allows us to do the work that we do each day.
And the thing about it is, sometimes size is a little bit relative. You say 48 schools is small. There's other jurisdictions where 48 schools would be a large district, right? So it's relative. But in your, because I think that's a fascinating thing. Because anytime I worked with Toronto District School, and I remember talking to John Malloy when he was director there, 538 schools or something like that. I said, there's probably schools I could name that you don't even know for sure if they're a school. Never mind of course, all the people, but to get to know it. So is there a strategy or some difference? Like you must feel relieved to have 48, just 48 schools, right? To be able to say, actually, this seems like I can build relationships, but you've also probably had to develop some strategies or approaches in those larger spaces that are just different because of the size. So I don't know if there's any, like, how does culture work differently in those large districts?
Well, that's interesting you say that because you try to build smaller communities within the larger context, and that's
Right.
the way you make sense of that scale. So for me, it's again being in spaces where you are again it's by doing the work that you build those relationships. So, for example, each time I've made a move from one jurisdiction to the next, it's always important to try as quickly as possible to get to know names. And of course, you make mistakes or you
Sure.
mispronounce at first, but eventually you get to know you get to know everyone. Certainly, in my district currently, I made it a key priority, and within the first month, I visited every school in the district, and I've continued to visit. And again, it's by being out there and connecting and being in classrooms, not just the principal's office, been in classrooms, talking to students in the hallway, in class, and asking some questions. And again, it's by asking those questions that you get to learn. So I would say there are different strategies, of course. For me, it's always just putting myself out there and saying, just meeting people and initially just saying to people up front, I apologize, but I may have to ask you your name several times until I get to a point where I don't have to do that anymore.
Right.
And
Right.
people are more than willing to, they say, oh, no worries. Just, and, uh, and of course, that level of comfort, I think is important.
And that concept of building smaller teams, I think that's the real secret because you can't know
Yes.
the size of 280,000 students or 12,000 staff, all these impossible numbers, but you can know the small group of people. And so I think building the structure where these teams thrive and
Yes.
people identify, and I think one of my favorite books is The 9 Lies of Work by Marcus Buckingham. And one of those lies is that people care about the company they work for, and they care about the team they're on.
Yes.
So they're much more, even within Richmond School District, they're much more connected to their local school than they are the district more broadly, right? Because they work with those people every day and serve that community.
Very good point.
So building that is really important. I don't know if you've had any sort of like any tips or ideas of building those kind of small teams that can connect.
Yeah, certainly. And I think one of the things that we often talk about is a lot of people in the district, a number of folks in the district were born and raised here in Richmond, went to school in Richmond, or teaching in our schools and so on. So they have a very strong affinity and connection to the
Right.
community. So the way there is already an established culture in terms of teamwork, in terms of doing the work because people care about the work. And in fact, I had the principal in one of our schools who actually attended an elementary school close by to that school. So you can see how that real connection. And I think it's again, recognizing that space, what is already established, and actually taking advantage in a positive
Mhm.
way of building, I should say, on that very strong foundation. Because you're not starting from scratch. You're starting
Yeah.
from a well-established tradition of excellence and commitment to the work. So for me, what an incredible opportunity to come into something that is already established and expanding the tent a little bit, because as educators sometimes we tend to be very bashful. So the question then becomes, how do we share the expertise? Because as in any system, it doesn't matter the size, scaling innovation is always going to be that. Maybe we'll get to talk about that sometime during the podcast. But I think, again, it's really leveraging the expertise that we have in the district, and a lot of good work happening. But to make sure that those things are not happening in silos, that we have the opportunity to bring people to the table and share
Yeah.
our expertise.
Let's talk about that. Let's go down that road. And I already know, because you're a little shy in answering how it is you make people feel the way Chris said they describe. You always feel better about it. It's because, and I think it has to do with what you just shared around. I'm looking for their strength. I'm looking for what is it about you, your school, that makes you work. And I think as much as that's an important idea. I think in general, we don't do a good enough job in highlighting what it is that we do. Schools often a deficit model, right? Kids come in and it's like, all right, let's find out all the things you struggle with. Sure. Yes. Let's do that. But why not start with what are the things you love? What are the things that matter to you? And, and I think so often kids' negative experience in schools come from the fact that nobody checked with them to find out what they love, what they are good at, and spend way more time on that than just always identifying all the things they're struggling with, which is often our agenda, not their agenda. They're like, that's something that we feel compelled to do. That's out of good, it comes out of a good place most of the time.
Yeah.
But I want you to you said you want to touch on that. So talk a little bit more about that sort of strength-based approach and building that internal capacity that you're seeing.
I'm so glad you talked about, because really that whole piece around sense of belonging, I think, is so critical for students, because it's really the foundation. And of course, as we all know, especially post COVID, the whole attention around student well-being and staff well-being is taking huge significance. Not that we didn't pay attention to that before, but I think we'll agree that there's hardly a jurisdiction a school jurisdiction now where there isn't that attention to it. But at the same time, I think that as we look at the populations and the communities we serve, I think it's important to really, again, to know, to your point, to start from the place of who are those students in our buildings that we serve and the communities that we serve. And I think it's really, it's a good, always a good starting point because again, the evidence will lead us, in my estimation, will lead us to a good place. Because again, it's really trying to understand the students, because if we understand the students, then we'll do well. But also, I would say that also looking at effective practices that that is happening in the district in many places, and to create opportunities for us to share those experiences. And of course, whether that's through organized professional learning sessions, whether it's part of our leadership, our monthly leadership gathering with our principals and the vice principals and system leaders, and trying to make sure that learning is the work, isn't it? So everything we do is about learning. And I think when, as leaders, when we model that practice of learning every day, and I learn from everyone in the organization, I learn from our students, from staff, regardless of their position in the organization. Of course, we all have different positions in the organization, but at the end of the day, we have a common goal. And that is how we get better each day in the work that we do to improve outcomes for students. So that's not to oversimplify it, but really it's again, just building on the willingness of the adults in the room to come together to do what's right for kids. And that's what we do.
And one of the things that was very clear to me when I transitioned from a classroom teacher to working at the district office was the opportunities that I had to witness and work alongside other adults that I could learn from relative to that experience as a teacher. It's always been a pretty isolating profession, and there would be probably days where there are classroom teachers who don't talk to another adult, who don't see another adult. And so the opportunity for them to learn from their colleagues is often pretty minimal. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on how do we do better at giving our professionals more opportunity to do just as you said. And again, maybe you and I have been more privileged to learn from others because we've been in positions where we get to do that a little bit more. But I know there's a segment of our profession that doesn't get that chance as much.
It's interesting you say so, because I think you will agree. And teachers say this all the time. The best form of professional learning for them is when they actually are in the same space with colleagues, sharing ideas and strategies that work. And they find that really impactful. And I would say that, yes, there are some days that are obviously structured in terms of professional development, what we call Pro-D, opportunities for teachers, certainly in secondary, to come together, but it looks different in elementary schools as well. So I think that what we try to do is in our district is, again, find those opportunities where we are really looking at, again, our strategic plan and trying to highlight, really focus on those aspects that we know makes a difference. For example, in our district, each school has something called our school story. And our school story is a way, it's really the school plan for the year and looking at some of their successes. And some of that information that data is qualitative and also some quantitative data. But again, so I think it happens at different levels. It happens at the school level. It happens at the district level. It also happens at the provincial level, depending on, again, each jurisdiction has a different approach to this. So I think that what we always leverage is opportunities for professional learning. And I think it's also very important, and I'm a big fan of this, to really tap into the expertise. And I think you've heard me say that a couple of times, to tap into the expertise of folks in the system, and to say, let's talk about ways in which we can share those expertise, but also not to be shy to welcome a critical friend from the outside, whatever that looks like. So we work as we have these conversations. We learn not only from within, or we learn from other districts. You and I had the privilege of being in Toronto for AI. So my good friend that you made reference to earlier on, Chris Kennedy, and others here in BC, in the Lower Mainland, have been, uh, we have a very collaborative working relationship, and not too shy to reach out and say, tell me a little bit about what's happening in your district. Well, let's, and also participate in those conversations. So I think there's a lot of learning that happens in-house, but also that happens within the province, and also across the country. Across the country, as we all grapple with very similar challenges around how we impact learning, teaching and learning in meaningful ways that at the end of the day makes a difference for young people. Because really, that's the ongoing work. We'll never get, as I often say, we'll never get to a day where we say, okay, everybody's at expectation now. Okay, let's go home.
Yeah, that's not going to happen. And you touched on something, and I want to see if you can. I'd love to hear your perspective on this. So, having worked in the Metro Vancouver area for 15 or so years, there's something really special and unique about the culture of neighboring, the way that districts work together, just a real desire to help each other, to work together, to coordinate. I don't see that same level of collaboration in other parts of Canada. And that's not to say it doesn't happen. I've seen it happen way more where you are now. Do you have any sense of why that is?
Well, that
Or maybe you disagree with me. Maybe you say it's happening everywhere. I think there's something special about what's happening where you are right now. But
well,
yeah,
a number of people have said that, and I've experienced it firsthand. And actually, you are absolutely correct that there's greater collaboration. Of course, you are right. This happens across everywhere. There's different levels of collaboration. But I would say that among my colleagues here, when I arrived here a little over a year ago, I just even before I arrived, people reaching out and say, "Hey, if you need anything, we are here. We are a strong team. Let's connect." And of course, I was very fortunate that I knew some of the folks who were already superintendents here in BC, and of course, it just made for an easier transition. But what I would say that it just is part of the culture, and I think part of it might be the sense of when we talk about size, and I appreciate the comment you made earlier. So in Toronto, for example, with over 500 schools, that scale in itself presents opportunities, but also some challenges. But I think so. The Lower Mainland, when you look at the size of our
yeah,
schools within each district, I think it allows for that level of collaboration, as you touched on. And so just the way we do business here, I've come to learn, and I'm all too happy to be part of it.
yeah. And I think geography, plays a part. You've got 15 or so districts that are within an hour
Yeah,
of each other. So that's really helpful. And then, but again, there is that sort of intangible of culture of the expectation is this is what you do. And so even looking at districts who have had successors to the superintendent position, they've passed that along. If you're going to be part of this, you don't just go off and work by yourself. You contribute to the larger group. And again, and then there's also this desire for equity across the entire province, right? To say, yeah, what about our friends in the northern parts
yeah.
of or the eastern parts of the province that may not have some of the resources and opportunities that you all do to get together? How can we help them? And so I just there's just a really positive culture that I always appreciate being involved in because and then the other thing you mentioned too is this kind of sweet spot of being very proud to build out your internal capacity and knowing that you have so much expertise within, but also willing to engage those, like you said, a critical friend to say, okay, what are we missing here?
Yeah.
Like we are doing good work. We're happy, but we're always wanting to learn more and we don't know everything. There's a little bit of humility there that goes a long way to just have that. It really is just a lovely culture that's built in so many of the Metro Vancouver school districts
I,
that,
yeah,
and again, I don't know if that's
uh,
feeling that too.
I could not agree more. And I think that the whole sense of that continuous improvement. cycle is one that, because you can look at any district, certainly Richmond is a good example, where you have high student achievement in terms of performance and what
Mhm.
have you. And yet the question then becomes, again, where are those places? How can we ensure that even students who are a particular level of, in terms of their level of achievement, can even do better? So that spirit of continuous improvement, there has to be real intentionality around that work. And, and being intentional allows us to have those really critical conversations from a place that is empowering, that is not, because it's a good challenge to have when you have
Sure.
a lot of students doing well. But at the same time, the sense of urgency is not lost on us, that we have to look at those populations. And here in BC, the provincial government talks about those categories of students who identify as Indigenous, children and youth in care, and students with disabilities and diverse abilities. And of course, for us, close to a third of our population here are English language learners. So when you look at those populations, again, to what extent are those achievement levels compared to the general population? And where do we need to really be, uh, wh- the strategies that we have at the district level and the work that we're doing? How do we leverage those expertise so that more students continue to experience success? At the end of the day, that's the work.
This episode is brought to you by Advanced Learning Partnerships, also known as ALP. We are a professional learning consulting group that serves communities across North America. We are partners, designers, and agents for change. You can learn more about the work we do at alplearn.com. And now back to the show.
Absolutely.
I want to talk a little bit more about you and your leadership journey, if you will. And you've been a classroom teacher, you've been a department head, you've been a vice principal, you've been a principal, you've been a coordinator, you've been a superintendent. So you've done all this stuff. And I wonder if you can think through all of those transitions. Was there one that was a little bit more difficult than the other in terms of, oh, there's a new skill set here I've got to learn that I don't have? You're always hoping that it's this nice little trajectory of each is a little stepping stone. But I'm sure that along the way, was there one that was like, wow, did I have a lot to learn in this? Can you point to one of those transitions?
Yes, I would say it's the transition from going from a principal. I was a principal of secondary school in Toronto, and going to the district office just prior to being appointed family of school superintendent in Toronto. So I think that transition of going from school based, because after 5 years as the principal, you I felt good about myself working with the school community and so on. And now when you move to the system, when you move to a system level, there's quite a bit of stress that comes with that. But of course, I was very fortunate that my transition from the principal role to the central office, I had some good mentors. So it wasn't like I showed up to the district office and I was left to figure it out on my own. But in terms of stress, leadership, it's again recognizing that uh, the pool was a lot larger than the one that I was previously swimming.
Right.
So now we have parents, we have all employees in the district, we have principals in all our secondary schools at the time. And of course, you have not only staff, but you also have community. And of course, so you are connected, you are connected to so many aspects of the organization that you typically may not engage in your role as a school-based principal. So for me, that was the, I would say, the biggest, going from a school-based to central office. But subsequent transitions were not as challenging in the sense that, as too well, you never do this work alone. In fact, quite frankly, if I've had any success in all that journey, as you pointed out, is because I've been very fortunate that I've had incredible mentors, and I've always been one who actually believes that there's actually strength. I just going back to the book in terms of the power of crowds, and I make reference to this often, and that is that if one is willing, and if one is willing to learn and willing to say, to be upfront in terms of what you don't know, there's always somebody who's going to say, yes, come along. I will show you how this gets done. And again, I think if you open yourself to that learning, good things happen. And it's been my experience throughout my career that educators, by and large, almost everywhere I go to, I'm more than willing to collaborate and to show you the ropes, so to speak, at whatever level of the organization that is.
So I'm going to ask a transition there to a question because you're setting me up for this because you talk about mentors, you talk about the people that help you. I want you to think of one person, Chris, just one, not all the people, because I know you could list a lot, and I know you're a person of gratitude. But today, I want you to think about one person that you're really grateful for in education, and even better if by chance that person might listen to this and hear their name in a shout out. So, who's that one person?
Please, this might surprise you, but I mentioned to you that I started my career on the reserve in Northern Manitoba. I remember a student. I remember a young man. His name is Fabian, and Fabian is probably in his, I would say, in his late 30s today. Fabian, I don't know if Fabian will see this podcast, but Fabian taught me what it meant, why this was important. He was a young man growing up in a very challenging situation. And I was a teacher my first year. And one of the things he taught me was that there is real value in public education and the work we do. And that resonated so much resonated for me because I grew up in a community and in a context where not everyone was fortunate enough to have the benefits of a strong public education as I have. So from that stance, certainly Fabian was that person. But in terms of my educational leadership, I'll mention somebody who was a former director in Toronto. Her name is Donna Kwan. I don't know whether you know Donna,
Yeah.
but she was director and I was superintendent in Toronto, one of the family of school superintendent. But she modeled extreme humility and excellence in education. For me, that sort of aligned with of course, there are other directors that I worked with in the district and other leaders that I've worked with throughout my career. But if I were to single out an individual that had a huge impact in terms of leadership and the reason why we do the work we do each day, I would certainly give kudos to Donna.
Nice. Lovely. If you were to give advice to like a young leader thinking about wanting to go into leadership and should I, whether it's start taking some courses or just dipping my toe into leadership, what advice would you give that 25-year-old teacher who's thinking about a career in educational leadership?
I would say, firstly, to reflect on why they seek a leadership role and and the and so first of all, once they made that determination that in fact they want to serve, because I think understanding the why is important. I would say find similar to what folks do in any area of life is you find somebody who's doing that work and you observe and you learn. So I would say that yes, getting the accreditation is one thing in terms of the preparation, but I think putting yourself in spaces where you are actually learning how to do the work is critically important. And that looks like being part of uh, a working group, being part of a committee, taking on initiative within your current context, whether it's at the school level or if you have the opportunity at the division level or at the district level. So anytime there is the opportunity for you to be part of a community of learners that allows you to stretch beyond your comfort level is value add because that skill set and that learning will serve you well, guaranteed, as you look down the road and as you continue on your leadership journey. So that's what I would offer: that continue to learn, learn it, and and always remember the why, because getting the job is one thing, but what gives you satisfaction in the job, in the role, and what makes you feel fulfilled is when you believe that you're making a difference, and that in your way, in one way or the other, you having an impact, and whatever that impact looks like. And so when people feel fulfilled in that role, in that sense, as I'm sure you will agree, then the work, it's you get up in the morning excited and ready to go to work, because that's what keeps you motivated. That's what keeps you. There's a purpose. There's a sense of purpose.
And that's what keeps you able to deal when there's difficult challenges that come. And that's a part of leadership. There's challenges. Can you look back at your career and think of a specific leadership challenge that you faced that really helped, that you really learned from, and it sticks in your mind as that was a really big learning moment, even though it may have been quite challenging?
Yes. Anytime in our roles, first and foremost, student safety is always number one. And we want to make sure, even before we talk about learning, and when parents send their children to school, the first thing they want to know that their students are safe, and that in that environment. So I would say that the example that I would use is, anytime you lose a student, it's always a challenge. And because it involves, there's so much emotion, understandably, that is connected to that, and the work that you have to do to build, to really be that support for your community as a leader in that space. So I would say that what was a real challenge for me just a few years ago was that we had an international excursion, and unfortunately, a student succumbed while away from home during that excursion. That was a very challenging experience. Nothing
Mhm.
prepares a leader for those situations, because the most difficult conversation I had was picking up that phone and speaking with a parent who are thousands of miles away, and expecting and awaiting the
Were you on the trip?
for the return. No, I was not on the trip.
Okay, but you were the
One of our principals was on the trip, and of course, as you can appreciate, it was a very emotionally challenging situation. And of course, we went through all the process and we did all the things we needed to do. But speaking to the parents and actually being present at the school, the first day back, this incident happened over spring break, and unfortunately, and but again, so that was difficult. But what it taught me was that at the end of the day, no matter what we do, and no matter what role we occupy as leaders, people want you first and foremost to be a human being. So policies and process and regulations, yeah, those are all good things that helps you navigate the work. But at the end of the day, don't forget to be a human. And for that parents and for those students and for that staff, what they needed wasn't a superintendent that moment. What they needed was a human being beside them, feeling the pain and recognizing that this is going to be a journey. Being
Mhm.
committed to being with them as we do whatever we could to help us get to a good place. So that was an example. It certainly stretched my leadership skill in terms of trying to work through a very difficult, very challenging process.
Those are things that it does take you back to your why. It takes you back to all kinds of perspective around why do we do this work, and certainly not anything you could prepare yourself for or even ponder. It's horrific to even think about those kind of things, but they happen, unfortunately. And whether it's something like that or suicides that happen on occasion, and they're awful things. And often the school community is the first place they look to for support.
Support. Yeah.
And this goes back to community. This goes back to, is there a place where they feel belonging?
Yeah.
And are there others who can be human with them and sit with them in those moments? And yeah, so many good things. That's powerful, Chris, and I appreciate that. Before I let you go, I got 3 kind of quick questions for you. I'm just always curious to hear from everyone. These 3. First question is, especially from a professional learning side, what are you reading? Some people are big podcast listeners or readers. What's on your bedside table or your office desk or your iPhone that you're listening to? What's the current professional learning you're?
It's interesting. Honorable Maurice Sinclair, as the
Just passed away.
who just recently passed. There's a book. It's called "Who We Are." This is a publication that came out, and I've just been reading this, and of course, he talks about the great questions of life, and there are those four questions that I so very much, and I've shared this with my leadership team when we meet weekly. I tend to try to find something to again connect to the why. So here are the four questions, and I think they're just brilliant, and this impacts on any one. Where do I come from? Was the first question. The second question is, where am I going? The third question is, why am I here? And lastly, who am I? And you attempted to maybe flip those questions around, starting with who am I? Those are the four questions that it posed. And I think it's important as we reflect on those four questions that it deemed to be the great questions of life. And of course, as we, given our, not only the work we're doing to advance truth and reconciliation and working with our Indigenous elders and rights holders here, but I think those four questions, I would encourage every leader to reflect on those four questions, because what it speaks to is really the purpose and the meaning of the work that we do. And so for me, that's what I'm currently reading. This,
You could build a whole curriculum around those four questions. That's school. You could do a whole school around those four questions. Just
yes.
pursue those for
So in fact, years, I have it right here. Who are we? Who we are, right? And of course, I was very fortunate that I had the opportunity of meeting the Honorable just Maurice Sinclair many years ago, and what a man of great humility and conviction. So for me, I've always been attracted to leaders who are humble and who bring that level of humility to their work. Because really, at the end of the day, we talk about the human connection, and I think when we are, that humility is what connects us to people in a way that is authentic and that allows us to really work well together.
fantastic. What about when, I don't know, maybe it's Friday. It's been a long week. You were hard. It's time just to sit down. I was like, okay, my brain can't go all the time. Sometimes it just has to, whatever, mindless, whatever. Is there anything you'd like to watch or consume from a little less academic and professional perspective?
Yes, I'm a bit. So the distraction I allow myself is I get to watch sports on TV. So I watch basketball or the occasional NFL game on the weekend, and of course the Raptors, the basketball game, and track and field. So for me, those, and occasionally, depending on the weekend, Premier League, soccer. I haven't grown up in, you know, uh, in a jurisdiction where soccer was all the rage in Nigeria back in the day. But anyway, so I would say the occasional indulgence would be watching sports on television. I know that's not very exciting, but
No, I do the same thing. In fact, the problem I have is there's so much sports I want to watch particularly on a weekend. I can record like 10 hours of sports, and then with my fast forward button and very timely, I can actually consume about half of that in about half the time.
wow.
So my wife I think I've got it down to a science. Yeah. Some people, and I always have the debate I often have with people. There are people who cannot watch recorded sports. It has to be live or they don't watch it, which is, I get it. It's just that you're very limited, because how often are you actually dedicating
That's
that
right.
time to be in front at that time? So
That's
I'm
right.
a big fan of recording. Like that's a technology I think is amazing. So last question, and again, you are a relative newcomer to the area, but that's okay. What have you come across as some go-to spaces or places in the Richmond area? So it could be restaurant, it could be parks, it could be just some place that might not be the most common, but places that you're finding, oh yeah, I'm really glad I live here because I get to do these things.
Yes, there's an area called the Stevson Village. If you ever visit Richmond, you must go to Stevson Village. And there's a rich history there. The restaurants are there, all the fishermen there. And there's actually something called the annual Salmon Festival, a festival that happens here. And there's a huge parade. What I love about it is that there's this legacy, a rich history that is still very much alive in terms of when you visit Stevenson Village, you will see the restaurants. And of course, if you're a fan of fish and chips, that's definitely the best fish and chips you will enjoy anywhere in Canada. And I'll say that, and I know some of my colleagues in the Atlantic provinces might disagree, but certainly Stevenson Village would be is the place to go to, and of course that you have the waterfront and the restaurants and the historical centers, and just at the mouth of the Fraser River. So it's just a beautiful landscape. It's a must see if you're the lower mainland and you're looking for some fun times as a
Yes.
family or as a single traveler, definitely lots to do there.
I have been there. Our friend Chris Kennedy has taken me there a few times. We've had some dinners there. I've been there with some other folks because it is, as you say, just a bit of a go-to place. Good call out there, Chris. Chris, this has been a delight. I'm so glad that we found some time to do this, and I'm looking forward to it because I think we're going to be able to connect a few different times in the next little while. So I'm just really grateful that we finally got to do this, and I think people are going to really enjoy so much of your perspective. And I thank you so much for your time and your insights and your leadership.
The pleasure is all mine, and thank you so much, Dean. And I must say, I've seen previous podcasts, and one of the things that I think that you're doing that is just remarkable is that you actually, in very interesting ways, this is action research in its purest form, because you are really tapping into the leadership ecosystem, not only across this country, but dare I say, south of the border as well.
Yeah.
Congratulations and kudos.
Thank you. That's been my goal. Thank you for iterating that, stating that's been my goal with this podcast, is to show our own selves, but those that might be curious about what happens in Canada and how it's different or similar from other parts of the world. And again, I'm so proud to be in Canadian leadership and to know all the leaders I have, and you're just one of those. So thanks again, Chris.
Thank you so much, Dean. I very much appreciate it.